Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. February 17th, 2023, Arkabutla, Mississippi. At around 11 a.m., authorities received a call about a suspect who pulled into the parking lot of a gas station in Arkabutla. It's a small rural town in northern Mississippi. With a population of only about 290 people, it's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else. Or at least they thought they did. Previously, the only thing that Arkabutla was known for was having been the birthplace of famed actor James Earl Jones. I'm not making that up. Last Friday, it became famous for something else. The suspect was armed with a shotgun and 2 handguns. He fired one of his guns into the driver of a pickup truck next to his vehicle, killing the driver, 59-year-old Richard Eugene Boyce. Boyce's brother Doug had been in the truck too, but fled on foot when the shooting started. The killer chased him into a wooded area before Doug got away. While sheriff's deputies were on their way to the scene of that killing, the killer was on his way to his next victims, who resided only a few miles away from the convenience store. The target this time was a mobile home belonging to a 60-year-old, Deborah Sue Crum, who lived there along with George Drain. The two weren't married, though George would refer to Deborah as his wife. Deborah had survived breast cancer. She had also suffered a stroke in October and was undergoing physical therapy for that. In fact, Deborah and George had just come back from a therapy session that very morning. Mr. Drain said that he had gone to answer the door when suddenly the door burst open and he was knocked down. Drain knew the assailant who had burst into the mobile home, a man George Drain hadn't seen in at least 7 or 8 years. The attacker immediately trained his weapon, a shotgun, on Deborah Crum and shot her once, wounding her. George Drain fought the attacker, trying to wrestle the shotgun away from him. The shooter beat George Drain with the butt of the rifle, striking him in the head multiple times. Drain's scalp was split open and his left earlobe almost cut in two. Drain was incapacitated by the vicious beating, but the man who attacked him told Drain not to make a noise or he would be killed too. Drain recalled seeing the attacker walk outside to reload his shotgun. The armed man then came back into the home, walked over to Drain's wife and shot her a second time, this time killing her. Miraculously, he left George Drain alive. The killer then left to go to a third location. This time it was a residence behind his own home. The killer went into this other residence and shot the owner of the home, 73-year-old George McCain. He also shot the woman who was there, George McCain's sister, 78-year-old Linda McCain. Then, after leaving that grisly scene, the killer drove onto an access road and fatally shot 2 handymen, George Rory and Charles Manuel, who were doing some kind of construction work on George McCain's roof. The killer murdered one of the men in his SUV. He killed the other man and left his body out in the road. The entire area was on alert as phone calls to the police about gunshots all around town poured in. An elementary school and a high school in the area had to go on lockdown while authorities searched for the spree killer. They wouldn't have to wait long. Authorities had arrived on the scene at the killer's home and took him into custody, alive, of course. They soon reported that the man in custody was 52-year-old Richard Dale Crum. He was a local man who largely worked odd jobs like cutting firewood. Investigators from the local sheriff's department to the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation to the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms have been working this case. They're still trying to piece together exactly what happened and why. It's still not known why he chose his first 2 victims, Chris Eugene Boyce, who he killed, and his brother Doug, who managed to escape. According to authorities, it's unclear whether he knew either of the 2 men. Doug, the brother who escaped Crum's attack, lives in Alaska. He was only in Arkabutla to help his brother clean up a property that they inherited from a deceased uncle. But as for the other victims, police know exactly why Crum targeted them. He had gone to the mobile home and murdered Deborah Crum because she was his ex-wife. According to an acquaintance of Deborah's, she was uncomfortable working the night shift at the Waffle House precisely because she wasn't sure what Richard Crum might do to her. Richard had been undergoing psychiatric therapy, but it seems that didn't change anything. Richard and Deborah had been separated for several years, and in September 2018, Deborah Crum filed for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. Richard reportedly told his ex-wife that as soon as he qualified for disability, he would leave her, which he did, with Richard going to live with his stepfather. The stepfather was George McCain, who would become Richard's third victim, along with George's sister, Linda McCain. Richard had been a caregiver for his stepfather and had even lived on George's 7-acre wooded estate. As for the two handymen who had been working on George McCain's roof, they seem to have merely been victims of circumstance. Wrong place, wrong time. Richard Crum has so far been charged with 1 count of capital murder for the death of Deborah Crum. The DA says that he only brought the 1 charge because that gives him the ability to convene a grand jury and to hold Crum without bail while he prepares the rest of the charges. In the aftermath of this gruesome incident, President Biden has given the predictable condolences speech along with the now empty calls for Congress to act. Yet another rural area, flyover country, salt of the earth, so-called real America. And these are the places where these massacres keep happening. But nobody points that out. They don't dare to. Nobody except for the black media. This kind of crime is all too common in the United States, but it's precisely because of its ubiquity that nothing is done about it. Congress doesn't act for the same reason that the white media doesn't report on things like this. This should have gotten wall-to-wall coverage, but instead it was buried. They preferred to talk about a university mass shooting instead because they liked who the killer was. Because for the white media to report on things like this and give this the wall-to-wall coverage it deserves, to focus on this, to point out where this stuff keeps happening and who's doing it, doesn't fit their narrative, though it would have if this had been a black shooter. That's the main reason why the university shooting was the one that they chose to focus on instead. But they weren't the only ones. We hear so much about Chicago, the South Side Chicago, mostly from Fox News. But of course they're not talking about this one because it doesn't fit their narrative. You see, last Friday, while Richard Crum was murdering 6 people in one small town of less than 300 people in a single day, meanwhile over in Chicago, 5 people died during the entire weekend. More people died in Arkabutla, Mississippi, a town of less than 300 people, than died in the entire city of Chicago, which is a city of 2.7 million people. You see, there's a big difference between a mass shooting and a mass killing. Don't ever let the white media conflate the two, because the victims in Arkabutla weren't just shot. They're dead. Most of the people who were shot in Chicago last weekend survived. None of the people who were shot in Arkabutla are alive today. Someone tries to talk about mass shootings, that's trick language. And the people doing it know it. It's like that whole thing about Me Too. They have to get the heat off of themselves, so they try to distract onto black people instead, America's favorite scapegoat. They've done it so much for so long that nobody even thinks to question it anymore. Nobody thinks that it matters whether a person has died from a shooting as opposed to simply being wounded. One's the same as the other when they need it to be. But that's the power of the corrupt and racist white media. They can manipulate the public through the use of weasel words and false comparisons, to the point that there's people who will think it's worse that 10 people got shot in Chicago than it is that 6 people were killed in Arkabutla. But let's be honest, most of the people who repeat the false news talking points, they already know what I'm telling you. They know that the Chicago narrative is largely a gross exaggeration, but they like to play along because they know that lies are a key part of maintaining white power. But these lies are what the white powers that be lean on to justify not doing anything about all these slaughters taking place in these rural and suburban areas. Right now, you have Republicans trying to push the narrative that the white rural conservatives should be angry about that train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. The Republicans are trying to say that because this happened in a white rural area, this proves that Joe Biden doesn't care about white people. Just the usual phony outrage from the Republicans. That's the GOP for you, always obsessed with race. Never mind the fact that black communities have been forced to deal with contaminated water and cancerous materials being put into the air that we breathe, and nothing's been done about that. Compare that to the all-hands-on-deck effort that's going on right now in East Palestine, Ohio. So we have the people who America has always done things for, the people who America rushes to protect, who are complaining that no one's coming to protect them. And if Republicans are so concerned about the safety of white residents in Ohio, we as the black media have been talking about the slaughters taking place in that state, such as the Pike County massacre in which 8 people were brutally killed, including children, and more recently Stephen Marlowe, who killed 4 people in August, at least one of them being a child. So why don't Republicans care about these white residents in Ohio killed by their own neighbors? because they can't use those deaths for political profit. But in this regard, the GOP aren't alone. Richard Crum lived in a very small town, a place where everyone knows everyone else, where his ex-wife told people she was scared of him. He was under some sort of psychological evaluation, yet he was allowed to have guns, and nobody in this small hamlet seemed to think it important to keep an eye on this man. This in a place where everyone knows everyone else. It's still very early days, but we've seen this scenario play itself out countless times before, and we already know that the police don't prioritize enforcing laws with some communities. If the police were to surveil and stop people and accost them in places like Arkabutla or Pike County the same way they overpolice and harass black residents everywhere else, then we'd see a lot less of these massacres. If the white media were to merely do their jobs and report on these incidents, certainly with the frequency that they deserve based on the number of people killed and how often it happens, if they were to simply explain to people what I explain every single week about where these killings keep happening, if they focused on Pike County and Arkabutla and the suburbs of Dayton and a number of other places instead of always hitting the snooze button and using the Chicago distraction instead, then people would be focusing on these areas. But of course, what goes unsaid that the white media already knows is that that would require some sort of encroachment on the freedom of the people who live there. Genetic immunity from law, not to mention the ability to go about one's life without being put under the thumb of a racist police state. Well, that's the exact opposite of what white power wants under any circumstances. And so, people can resume holding their breaths for the next slaughter that's going to take place. Tragically, they won't have to wait long. And we all know why. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. King Edwards, Sakina Collins, Rebellious Zoe, Jerlene Harris, and Anthony Pollard. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.